All right, good morning. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I think I'm still in the morning. It's been a long day, but good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to this fourth and final forum in our Force for Good series on opportunity and inclusion. My name is Maxwell Okello. I'm the Chief Executive of the American Chamber of Commerce here in Kenya, for those who may not have met me. I wish to thank and recognize our partners, Hudson and Sandler, who have walked this journey with us to make this Force for Good initiative possible. Hudson Sandler is an independent, award-winning strategic communications and ESG consultancy providing global best practice in Africa. I also want to recognize and thank our guest speakers for accepting the invitation to participate in today's forum. We have with us Irene Mbari-Kirka, who's founder of inAble. We also are joined by Samson Kanai, who's the Regional Sustainable Development Manager at Corteva, Agriscience. And we also have with us Robert Karanja, who's the board chair of B-Lab East Africa. To all of you in attendance today, in our audience, who have taken their time off your busy schedules to join us, we say thank you and karibuni sana. So before we begin, some quick pointers. Our session will be 1.5 hours long, so just about 90 minutes, and is divided into 3 segments. So the first segment is a brief introductory welcome segment, where myself and Chris will share a few remarks. Then I will, after that, get into the the second segment, and actually the main segment of the afternoon, where we'll hear from our 3 speakers, beginning with Irene Mbari-Kirka, followed by Samson, and we conclude that segment with Robert. Thereafter, there will be a moderated panel discussion that will feature the 3 speakers. The panel discussion will be moderated by Chris, and thereafter we will close promptly at about 4:30. I urge all of you to submit your questions or any comments that you have as the session progresses in the chat box. And when we get to Q&A, in case you have a burning question that you'd like to ask directly, please raise your hand and the moderator will be able to call you out. We request that you keep your mics muted the entire time and your videos off so that you can have a good experience during this call. So ladies and gentlemen, the AmCham Force for Good initiative is a platform that we created to champion and amplify business sustainability and social impact initiatives and practices. Throughout this series, we have sought to demonstrate that sustainable business practices have a catalytic and positive impact on business performance and overall long-term economic growth, and that profit and sustainability can actually be complementary. So far, we focused on climate and biodiversity within the environmental aspects of sustainability. We've also looked at the economic and the social arm, where we've spotlighted inclusive and sustainable finance. And so today, we turn the spotlight on business practices that combat poverty, increase inclusion, and expand opportunity. For economic growth to be sustainable, it is essential that we be inclusive, meaning that conditions must deliberately be designed to integrate all within the population, bridging inequalities and allowing all to access quality work and shared prosperity. For business, this could mean, for example, creating equitable work environments that integrate disadvantaged populations and offering living wages. It could also mean building the capacity of low-income farmers or small businesses to integrate fully into supply chain or developing innovative distribution approaches to hard-to-reach communities, amongst other interventions. So today, we get to hear and learn from AmCham member companies on how they have integrated inclusivity in their business and what the result of that has been. But before we get into the meat of today's discussion, I want to recognize at this point and welcome our key partner, Chris Genasi, who's the chairman, Hudson Sandler, Africa, to give his remarks. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Maxwell. Hudson Sandler is absolutely delighted to partner with this initiative and showcase all the great examples of a business as a force for good in Kenya. Today's subject of diversity and inclusion is a topic that's very dear to my heart. I've done a lot of my career over the years looking at particularly inclusion for disabled people. So I'm really, really looking forward to today's session and to hear, you know, because it's so important how we increase the representation of women, disabled people, and diversity in general in the workplace, and also how we can create economic empowerment for women and girls, for the youth, for disabled people. These are kind of like vital issues that that businesses are addressing, and it'll be fascinating to hear from the speakers about what they're doing to advance that whole cause. So without any further ado, I would like to ask our first speaker, Irene, to tell us, who's the founder and executive director of inAble, tell us about her work. Irene.
Thank you so much, Chris. Give me one moment to share my screen. I have a short presentation. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, fantastic. So thank you so much, Chris, Maxwell, and the AmCham team for inviting me to come and share more information about what we do at inAble. I want to start by saying that disability is one space that has been forgotten for a long time. And a lot of businesses have really been scared of getting into disability and the technology space. The minute you bring in technology, everybody gets mixed up. So, and I want to say that we have to remember that any of us can get any form of disability at any one point. 70% of disabilities are hidden, which means that today you might have employees, you might have your own colleagues, you might have family members who even have a disability and you're not even aware. So it's important for us to understand that we may not see the disabilities, but they do exist amongst ourselves. And that's very, very critical for businesses to embrace disability, both in their employment, but also in their products and services. And since we've decided to go digital, then we need to ensure that for all the products and services that we have, they're also accessible to people with disabilities. So thank you so much. My name is Irene Mbari-Kirka. I'm the founder and executive director of inAble. inAble is a nonprofit organization that's based in Nairobi, Kenya, and Washington, DC. And we empower students with disabilities through technology. The picture you see here is a picture of one of our computer labs. So we have assistive technology labs in Kenya. And this project started with a very simple story where I met blind students and I realized I had no clue what they do for a living. At the same time, I tried to investigate what do they do when they graduate and how do they study. I discovered that one, they share Braille books, and Braille books are very heavy to carry around, so they can't even have storybooks, mini storybooks, and they are costly at the same time. But when I tried to find out about employment, I discovered one, they graduate with Braille skills, joining a world that's completely oblivious to Braille. At the same time, they get into begging and prostitution for survival. So from that, I was able to do some research, and I ended up meeting people who use technology, people who are blind who use technology. And we raised $3,400 with my friends. And with raising the $3,400, we established this lab that you're looking at, our first assistive technology lab in 2009 at Thika Primary School for the Blind. And from there, we've been able to scale the program to 6 schools for the blind. And what we do is we partner with schools for the blind. We come in, we set up assistive technology labs, and with the assistive technology labs, we provide basic computer skills training to students on a daily basis. And we do both students and their teachers. And we've been able to see great progress because we see students who move from just learning how to use the keyboard. It can take us 6 months to teach a blind student how to use a keyboard. But trust me, once you give them the skills they need, then you've set them free. From there, the sky is the limit for them. So that's really what inAble does, is really trying to make sure that people with disabilities have the skills they need to be able to thrive in this digital economy. So today, when I say 70% of disabilities are hidden, I want you to think about the 60 to 80 million Africans who live with some form of disability. And these are Africans who don't even get any digital products and services. They don't have access to digital products and services because those products are not accessible. So there's a huge market opportunity there, whether it's for employers or it's for products at the same time. We also want to end the marginalizations of Africans with disabilities when it comes to technology. I think during this COVID season, most of us have been talking about this issue of technology and disability for a long time, but COVID has made many companies realize that actually most of their digital products and services do not serve people with disabilities. So it's important to have people with disabilities in mind as we design our digital products and services. I mentioned before how computer skills actually give people with disabilities independence to explore the world, to go to school, to get into employment. So, and our goal is also to make sure that we work with employers to open doors for youth with disabilities. We have to think about, if we think about Kenya, and I'm talking to AmCham, think about your membership. How it's the law in Kenya that 5% of companies need to retain 5% of their employment opportunities to people with disabilities. How many companies who are members of AmCham really meet that number? There's an opportunity to grow and help different companies become more inclusive. So I'll take a step back to and speak again about the education program that we have. So as I mentioned, inAble partners with schools for the blind, and I'll take the honor of mentioning where we are. We are at Thika Primary School for the Blind, Thika High School for the Blind in Thika. We are at St. Lucy's Primary School for the Blind and High School for the Blind in Meru County. We are at Likoni Primary School for the Blind in Mombasa County. And we are also at St. Oda School for the Blind in Siaya County. Now, these are only 6 schools for the blind, but Kenya has 16 schools. But also the issue of technology and skills training for students with disabilities is not unique to blind students only. We also have schools for the deaf and schools for people with physical disabilities and other disabilities. And all these students need access to technology and skills training. So inAble's goal is really to scale this program across the country. And if we achieve across the country, we can go to other African countries. And this will help these students gain the skills they need to be able to achieve anything they want in life, whether it's going into higher education, going into employment. They need the foundational skills to be able to survive. And this is one program that rarely gets funding. I'm sure if you did an inventory to see how many companies are actually investing in education and technology for students with disabilities, even if they're doing education program, they are very limited. So I urge your companies to please step up and embrace technology for people with disabilities and invest in that space. And I'll say this, if you invest in education for youth with disabilities and students with disabilities, you're investing in the future of disability. Next, during the COVID season, what we found out is that for the whole year, students with disabilities did not have access to any type of education or skills or any resources to help them be able to continue with the school program, like the way mainstream schools did. So what we did, we partnered with Google, and Google gave us some funding to implement a homeschooling learning project. So we took our devices, we took laptops, we loaded with all the resources the students needed, and our instructors went across the country to distribute the laptops. It was a pilot project of about 40 students and teachers. And what was interesting, this is a student who is at home, and what happened is that our students camped closer to their homes for about 2 days to help them sort of master the new keyboard and everything. But what was interesting is that these students had access to resources, they had access to their teachers. And I recently had a meeting with the principals, and they said the students who participated in this program really achieved a lot, even the self-confidence they gained, because during COVID, a lot of students struggled. So let me go back there. And this is a program that we totally believe, as we talk about scaling technology to students with disabilities, every student deserves to have their own device and access to resources for them to be able to compete at a level playing field with every other student. When it comes to employment, what inAble does, we train students on simple skills like basic computer skills, but we try to take them to the next level, which is coding. This is one of our high school students, and he's learning how to code. What we found is that with students with disabilities, if you're going to provide any employable skills training, don't wait until they graduate from high school. You need to start this from a very, very early stage. Some of our students start learning how to code from 6th grade. So if a student is ready, you start implementing your employable skills training, because it does take a while to train someone with a disability. But if you put the right resources in the right time, you will be able to get the results that you want. So I always say youth with disabilities are the most underestimated group of youth in the world, because when we meet them as employers, we don't think about their capabilities. We think about their limitations. So we need to look and see what can we do as employers. Number one, we need to make sure that companies can meet the 5% requirement. And I'm sure a lot of companies do support the SDGs. So it's critical that you meet the 5% requirement, provide employment to people with disabilities. And if you don't find the resources, provide skills training. We have to invest our resources in skills training. If you think about people with disabilities, there's been no investment even in their education in such a long time. So when employers say they can't find people who are qualified with disabilities, it might be partly true. But what that means is take a step back and invest in education. Because if you invest in education, a few years from now, those will be your employees. Those will be the same people using your products and services. The last point is, if you hire someone with a disability, provide the right accommodations, the right assistive technology, the right environment for them to be able to thrive and to work efficiently. That's a very, very critical piece, because getting employment is one thing, but surviving in that environment is another thing. So it's very also important for employers to make sure that they integrate people with disabilities in different departments and go through awareness training for your employees so that they can know how to interact and to communicate with people with disabilities. So something else inAble has been able to do is focus on accessibility research. And last year we did a very, very interesting project with the Kenya Bankers Association. And we did a study. We wanted to find out how many people with disabilities are using the banking products, simply because during COVID, everything went online. People are told, don't come into the branches, use your mobile apps or use your online services. But what we found, less than 27% of people with disabilities actually use mobile money applications. Why? The products are not accessible. And this is a very, very critical piece. And I have to commend the Kenya Bankers Association, because they've taken major steps to train their staff on even sign language, to train and to provide the resources needed to make sure they're more accommodating to people with disabilities. And they're going through the right steps to make sure that by the end of it, when the banking industry is sharing their products and services, that they all have a roadmap to ensure that their products are accessible before they get out into the market. So this is a very, very commendable project through the Kenya Bankers Association. Second, we partnered with UK Aid, and what was interesting was to do a study during the COVID season to see, are students with disabilities really going to school, or what's really going on? And what we discovered, as mainstream students had laptops and access to education, students with disabilities had nothing. Some opportunities were provided where maybe education was on radio. But the problem is, if I'm blind and I'm listening to something on radio, sometimes the way it's explained, it doesn't make sense to someone who's blind. But also think about radio for someone who's deaf. So there was a lot of challenges, and speaking to students and parents, there was a huge frustration, and most of them were prepared to come back to school. And one thing we discovered when we compared to the homeschooling project we did, those students had a different mindset. They were happy to stay home, they had their laptops, they were communicating, and they were connected. So that was a very interesting case study that we did. And last but not least, we've had a 10-year partnership with Georgia Institute of Technology. And most of it is really to do research on the intersection of technology and people with disabilities. Let me take a step back. I forgot to say this one. What is digital accessibility? I meet people every time I say digital accessibility, they say, Irene, I only know access to food or access to healthcare products and stuff like that. So what I want you to take away from this conversation is that, what are your digital products? They are websites, mobile applications. If you provide any services, all we are saying is for that product to be accessible, all you need to remember is that this is when all users with or without disabilities can obtain the same information and perform the same functions. Meaning, if you have an online application and you want people to sign up, if I have a disability and I'm using assistive technology, I should be able to sign up independently without seeking help. When it comes to mobile money applications, I should be able to do a simple transaction to transfer money without seeking help. Because what happens for mobile money applications, people have to get other people to help them. And right there, privacy and the whole essence of banking is completely diluted because there's no privacy, there's no security. As soon as you give someone your banking information, then you're compromising yourself. So please remember, it's when all users with or without disabilities can obtain the same information and perform the same functions, meaning that people with disabilities are not asking for any favors. All they're asking for, we need access to what you're providing to the public. So to be able to support the Kenyan public and private sector, to be able, because the conversation on digital accessibility is very new in Africa, inAble partnered with the Kenya Bureau of Standards and ICT Authority and Communications Authority. And for the last 6 months, we've been developing a digital accessibility standard. And this is very, very exciting because it will cover both public and private sector. So if you're developing a website, you'll have a technical requirement of what you're supposed to do to ensure that it's fully accessible. If you're providing a digital service or sharing digital documents, all that will be very well documented for you. So this is huge for us because this is the first in Kenya. I have to say some first world countries don't even have digital accessibility standards. So I commend the Kenyan government for embracing inclusion, and we hope actually the document, the first draft is out for public review and everyone can get access to it. And in the next, after 60 days from now, we're going to get together by the end of January and wrap up and submit the document for approval by the Kenyan government. The advantage with this is that this is not unique to Kenya only. So there's an opportunity for us to share knowledge with other African countries and really promote inclusion through some of the companies that you work with across the continent. So something that inAble does to make sure there's continuous education, as I mentioned, digital accessibility is very new in Africa. So we want to make sure that there's continuous education. So we do host what we call the inclusive Africa Conference. We've hosted last year, this year, and next year. And what we do is we bring Africans from across the continent and also the globe to come and discuss digital accessibility. How does it affect education? How does it affect employment? How does it affect your products and services? What products have you developed and do not accommodate people with disabilities, and what do you need to do? So this has been a great way to bring people together. So next year on May 25th through the 26th, we do plan to host an in-person conference, but we'll also have a hybrid because we are planning to host another 20 countries will be live streaming online. So we encourage you to join us, to reach out to us to understand how your company can participate, how we can discuss your products and services, how we can talk about employment. And we want to talk about this technology because technology has had some negative or unintended consequences. You know, we build all these products with all the right intentions, but bottom line is how can we address the unintended impact on people with disabilities? So I'm closing by saying that technology is a very powerful tool, but it also creates a digital divide. But if we come together, we can all begin to understand how people with disabilities use technology and how our products have an impact on people with disabilities. Please remember, if you design for people with disabilities in mind, you design for everyone because you'll be addressing very major requirements or challenges from the onset of your design process. So accessibility begins from the design process all the way to implementation of a product. So I want to say thank you very much. And if you're interested in contacting inAble to learn about our assistive technology products or our programs or the conference or anything, please reach out to us. Thank you so much.
Wow, Irene, thank you so much for that. This has just been eye-opening for me. It's amazing the work that your organization is doing. It's such a noble venture and intervention, and I feel that God blesses the work that you're doing at inAble. Take out for me is just that challenge to shift our mindsets from looking at to look at abilities as opposed to limitations of those people with disabilities. I think that's really powerful and something that I take away, because it's so natural to do that. And so we have to be very deliberate and intentional with how we look at people with disability. So thank you for that. I'm sure there'll be a lot more engagement and nuggets of wisdom from you when we get onto the panel. So at this point, I want to invite Samson. Samson Kanai is the Regional Sustainable Development Manager for Corteva Agriscience to give his presentation. So Samson, you can turn on your video and put on your mic and go ahead.
Thank you, Maxwell. I think Eva, if you could put up my slide. Yeah, so thank you so much, and glad to be participating in this session to talk about Corteva's work in driving inclusion, specifically focused on women and youth in Kenya and beyond. Just a brief introduction for those who may not be familiar with Corteva. We are an agriculture pure play company operating at a global scale, providing a wide range of portfolio of agricultural products to farmers from seed, underseed, and crop protection, as well as digital solutions. So here in Kenya, we are quite focused in driving women and youth inclusion in agriculture. If you could go to the next slide. Yeah, so a bit of background on how the women participation in agriculture looks like in the wider region as well as here in Kenya. Women produce about 60 to 80% of food in most developing countries, and contributing to about 42 to 60% of labor to produce that food. At the same time, women provide majority of labor in rice farming, mostly planting, weeding, and harvesting. And this it's not just in rice, but in other key staples here in Kenya and in sub-Saharan Africa at large. And that seems quite mismatched with the kind of returns they get from that, mostly being providers of labor as opposed to being owners of enterprise for food production. So specifically looking at rice, only 25% of rice farmers are women in Kenya. So you can see agri at large is male dominated, and 25% production, 25% ownership of production means women are missing big opportunities in terms of incomes associated with rice production. Next slide, please. So as Corteva, we are committed to driving women inclusion in agriculture value chains. And this is outlined in our 2030 sustainability goals, which are quite specifically focused on building the capacity of women growers to be able to participate and make a living out of agriculture. So we have 4 key pillars under our 2030 sustainability goals. One, in it for the farmers, which the specific area where it has women is where we seek to enrich the lives of 500 million smallholder farmers. This is a global target, and definitely this has been broken down to regional and sub-regional levels and numbers for targets for 2030. And this also focuses in communities where we have an ambition to empower women and enable youth in the communities, in the broader participation in the agriculture value chains, as well as looking at other enabling factors such as access to education, access to training, and other tools. So under this, the key focus areas is improving livelihoods for women who are smallholders, building capacity of women who are agripreneurs, as well as using our crop protection products to reduce the number of hours and putting and channeling those hours to other more productive activities through our crop protection products. Next slide, please. Yes. So I'm going to point out some of the case studies of some of the work that we are doing here in Kenya in support of women smallholder farmers. And one such project is where we have partnered with Land O'Lakes, ILRI, and Forage Genetics to improve or to enable women contribute to addressing milk shortage in Kenya. And the key product here we have corn silage, which is which builds into the production of animal feeds. And feeds actually do make the largest component of, they make up the largest cost component of production in dairy farming, and making up to 60% of that. So by providing quality corn silage seeds and as well as access to agronomy education, we are enabling women to be able to effectively participate as smallholder dairy farmers, as well as addressing the acute shortage of milk here in Kenya. Yeah, so the other initiative we have under this is Corteva Women in Agriculture, which is a project based in Meru County, where we are supporting about 20,000 women who are smallholders to improve productivity in maize production. And we are not just stopping at giving them quality seeds. We are also supporting them with agronomic education, on-farm training, as well as embracing sustainable farming practices. And as you may be aware, one of the other biggest challenges facing smallholder farmers is access to markets. So we have been working with off-takers to be able to buy this grain produced by these women, so as to have that end-to-end solution and to enable women effectively participate in the agriculture value chains. Yeah, so the last case study I would like to highlight is an entrepreneurship program we have for women in agriculture in partnership with Strathmore, whereby we are training women agripreneurs to be able to effectively manage their businesses. And in doing this, we're equipping them with business acumen skills so that they can be able to effectively manage their business and out of that, also seeking to achieve a multiplier effect, whereby for every 10 women that we train, they are able to reach to about 150 women agripreneurs, and out of that, scale the impact that we're having. And the end objective of this being serving up at the end of it, or at the end of this initiative, we seek to impact about 750,000 women farmers to enable them effectively participate in food production and earn a livelihood out of this. So those are the key case studies and some of the initiatives we have under women inclusion in agriculture in Kenya. Back to you, Maxwell.
Thank you very much, Samson, for that. Very concise, very clear. It's great to hear the work that you're doing with women. And as you mentioned, women are critical in the agriculture ecosystem. And so being able to include them in a very meaningful way in the production and of course, as you move down the value chains is actually one thing that I think is imperative for that space. So we'll move on to our next speaker. So I want to welcome Robert Karanja, who's the chair of B-Lab East Africa, to give us his presentation. Over to you, Robert.
Thank you very much, Maxwell, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'll be speaking generally about our work here at B-Lab East Africa on opportunity and inclusion in the workplace. And I'll try and make my presentation as quick as possible. Next slide, please. So just a bit of background on B-Lab East Africa, founded in 2017. The B-Lab began by building some of the most basic market infrastructure that entrepreneurs said that they needed and that they needed to succeed. And this basically included performance standards, a legal framework, and also a unifying brand, which became known as the B Corp movement. In a very short period of time, there were about 4,100 B Corps, 10,000 benefit corporations, and about 150,000 users of the B Impact Assessment, which I'll speak about later, and about 60 million digital followers of B Corps, all with a unified vision of the power of purpose in business. Next slide, please. So how do we define purpose? For business, purpose not only exists in what is achieved on the outside, but also in an equally important sense eternally as well. And essentially what this looks at is emphasizing purpose as the bottom line in the true definition of business success. Next slide, please. And where does purpose cut across for any organization? Essentially, what separates a purpose-driven business from the rest is longevity and authenticity. We've seen from experience that companies that lead with purpose and build around it can achieve continued loyalty, consistency, and relevance in the lives of their consumers and communities where they operate. And so for this session specifically, we're going to focus on stakeholders and how purpose aligns to stakeholders. Staff and employees are also a huge part of what determines business success, and creating conducive opportunities for them to thrive and be their best affects the bottom line of any organization. Next slide, please. So expanding opportunity and inclusion in the workforce includes diversifying so that companies can remain competitive. We know that diversity and inclusion always go hand in hand, and a diverse and inclusive workforce is one that will employ people of different ages, races, genders, languages, and cultural backgrounds. It also means that we hire from often underrepresented and minority groups like women and differently able persons, and where everyone's voice is heard, valued, and respected. We have seen from experience that companies that embrace diversity and inclusion do tend to report high engagement, lower turnover, and increased profits. And a strong diversity and inclusion program can always improve knowledge sharing, decrease turnover, and increase loyalty in a company. Next slide, please. So speaking briefly about B-Lab's internal JEDI approach, and JEDI stands for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion within organizations. This is a commitment really to a focused and sustained action to dismantle systems, policies, practices, and ideologies that do not propagate for inclusion. And we've seen recent cases of this over the last 2 or 3 years as we continue to learn about injustice and embrace radical orientation of businesses. We're also looking to lead our staff through curated trainings, which focus on a global cultural competency, white supremacy and anti-racism, focused on executive leadership and B-Lab's people and operations team, by giving access to these resources, not only to board members, but also to B-Lab global partners, such as B-Lab in East Africa. Next slide, please. I just wanted to provide a bit of background on some of the B Corps that we do have in East Africa that are creating opportunities and inclusion. And I'll essentially speak about Equilibrium, Imani, and Zuna. So in 2014, Equilibrium Kenya did not have any data regarding women in management. And in 2019, during their B Corp recertification, women constituted somewhere between 40 to 49% of their management team. At the same time, Imani Development in 2017 did not have a policy on discrimination. And by 2020, they had written a non-discrimination policy that covered gender, race, color, disability, political opinion, sexual orientation, age, religion, and HIV status. And finally, Zuna. During Zuna certification in 2014, women in management constituted about 40%. And about 5 years later, in 2019, during their recertification, women in management constituted about 50%. So those are just 3 local case studies that we can draw upon. And I should also have mentioned at the beginning that currently, the B Corp movement in Africa has about 53 B Corps, and of course that number could improve and get larger as we move along. Next slide, please. So what are some of the benefits to inclusion in the workplace? Deloitte has undertaken studies that determine that millennials tend to stay longer with companies that understand the needs of a diverse and inclusive workforce. And this is a huge difference compared to previous generations. And according also to research from the Harvard Business Review, firms with more women on their boards have a 42% higher sales return, 66% higher return on invested capital, and 53% higher return on equity. So clearly there are benefits of inclusion in the workplace. It's really a no-brainer. Next slide, please. Again, benefits of inclusion in the workplace. We do know that employees who feel engaged become more involved in their work. They tend to deliver better results. And they also showed interest, respondents also do tend to show interest in organizations that do not only foster an inclusive culture, but also care about closing the gender pay gap. Next slide, please. One other key benefit of inclusion in the workplace is that when an organization tends to have people with different skills, life experiences, and cultural backgrounds, then they're more than likely to get fresh and new ideas. Multiple voices, multiple personalities will always give a fresh perspective, and this can lead to higher productivity and also strengthen the competitive advantage of that company. Next slide, please. But again, inclusion in the workplace does also come with its own challenges, and we've seen this from not only the B Corp movement, but also from non-B Corp companies. And starting at the top with leadership, organizational change will always start with the leadership of any organization, so whether it's the board and then the executive team. And upper management definitely needs to allocate resources to diversity and inclusion efforts, because without those resources, then D&I becomes a challenge. And these D&I initiatives must also align with organizational goals and company values. Otherwise, they tend to be pushed to the back burner. It's also important to measure, is D&I improving within an organization? How do you measure this and how do you track it? And this will include, of course, having the right tools in place. An organization may need annual surveys, practice continuous listening, having real-time insights to what the employees are feeling and what they're saying when it comes to D&I in the workplace. The B-Lab movement has offered free tools for businesses of any size to measure how they are directly impacting diversity and inclusion among their workforce. And these tools tend to offer improvement plans for businesses looking to set up and improve D&I framework within the organizations. And finally, training. Training is important. Management is a key component to successfully including D&I in any organization. And therefore, management will need to be trained on what the goals are, why they're important, and what is expected of every manager's interaction with employees. Leadership teams also need to lead by example. And then this needs to cascade down within the organization as often as possible. And feedback goes back and forth between management and others within the organization. Right. So next slide, please. I just wanted to speak briefly also about a B-Lab tool called the B Impact Assessment, which is a free, confidential, industry-specific online tool that not only measures, but also manages, compares, and improves a company's social and environmental impact. And it looks at 5 key pillars, one being governance, environment, workers, community, and also customers. I won't get into the details now because that will probably take us another hour or so, but it's a free tool and you can just Google it and feel free to download it and also play around with it off the internet. Next slide, please. So essentially the BIA covers the 5 pillars: governance, workers, community, environment, and customers, with the ones listed in black under each pillar being operational impact, and the ones listed in red being the impact business model elements of each of those pillars. So governance will always look at a company's overall mission, ethics, accountability, and transparency. When we look at the workers, we'll look at what does the employee well-being look like, what does satisfaction look like in that organization. It also looks at topics related to compensation and benefits, training, occupational health and safety, job ownership and job flexibility. Community will look at the company's community engagement and impact, including supplier payment terms. The environment section will evaluate company's overall environmental stewardship, including facilities, resource use, emissions, and when applicable, its supply chain and distribution channels. And finally, the customer section will evaluate companies whose products or services are designed to address a particular social problem through its customers, such as health or educational products. And companies that score at least 80 points in this assessment are eligible for B certification. And of course, successful verification will lead to B Corp status. Next slide, please. I'd briefly like to talk about the Sdg Action Manager, which was a tool that the B-Lab, together with the UN Global Compact, put together to provide a free access impact management platform that would then measure businesses' approach towards the SDGs. We essentially took features of the B Impact Assessment and then 10 principles and SDGs embedded in mission. And we've had at least 70,000 users around the world use this over the last few years, with 10,000 plus signatories around the world. We, as the B-Lab East Africa movement, we do have specific projects that are geared towards promoting diversity and inclusion among businesses in Africa. The first one includes a financial literacy for women program that looks at micro startup businesses and funded by the International Foundation to train women on financial literacy skills in 4 counties in Kenya. And this is in Machakos, Murang'a, Kisumu, and Mombasa. And we do have a second program funded by the World University Service of Canada that looks at youth and people living with disabilities that has just kicked off in 4 counties. And please do feel free to get in touch if you'd like more information on some of those programs within B-Lab East Africa. Final slide, please. Thank you. And I've come to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much, Maxwell. Over to you.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Robert. Very, very insightful. And thank you so much for tying for us clearly the impact of D&I on the bottom line. I'm sure several of our audience members here are, hard-nosed corporate type people. And so, some of these could be seen as or come across or perceived as being soft. And so I'm sure there are people who are asking themselves, so how does this benefit my business if I'm to deploy a D&I policy within my organization? So thank you for that. All right, so we will move on to the third segment, which will be a moderated panel discussion. And I'll hand over to Chris to take us through this particular segment. So Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Maxwell. Listening to all the speakers, the thing that strikes me about diversity is how diverse it is. You know, it covers with gender, disability, religion, sexuality. You know, there are many communities, groups of people who are underrepresented in the workplace and in society. And I was really struck by the comments around culture. I just wondered if the panel, sorry, I should just say to welcome to the panel my colleague Rebecca Gudgeon, who is Head of Sustainability at Hudson Sandler. Rebecca's going to be joining the panel. Welcome, Rebecca. And also to say, if anybody has any questions, they can put them in the chat and I will try and pass them on to the panel as many as I can. So, yeah, I wanted to just talk a little bit about culture. I was struck by a number of the speakers talked about the importance of culture within companies to embrace diversity and inclusion. And Irene, you made the point that, you know, it's difficult for companies to employ disabled people, but, you know, it's not, employing people is just the start. They need to be welcomed, listened to, heard, and happy in the workplace. So I guess a question perhaps for Robert to start. How can companies change their culture to be more embracing of D&I?
Good question, Chris. And you know, I think in many instances or in many cases, organizational culture is really set from the top, and the general body within a company does tend to pick the culture that really trickles down from the top end. So meaning at the board level, so the governance level, and then moving on to the senior leadership team, and then eventually to management and everyone else in the company. So I think it's important that leaders, you know, not only you know, speak about it, but actually put their words into action. When looking at D&I, it's very attractive to always put targets and to put numbers and state that, you know, we would like to move, say, the number of women at the senior management level from X% to this percent, but it has to be a very deliberate effort. And naturally, of course, as that shift does start to happen, you know, you're measuring and you're tracking it. And for many organizations that are probably starting from very low numbers, and they need to up some of those D&I numbers, it's obviously going to come with a lot of challenges. But how they navigate that and the examples that are set from the top, starting off with the board and the senior management team, really will define the culture that organization takes right across the board. So I would say it's really a very deliberate effort that starts right at the top and then trickles down to the rest of the organization. Thank you.
Thank you. And what are some of the sort of most common mistakes, if you like, that you see companies making in not embracing D&I, you know, that we could learn from in your experience? Irene, perhaps that's the question for you. You deal with lots of companies.
Looks like Irene dropped off.
Oh, she dropped. Oh, I see. I'm sorry. I didn't realize.
Chris, can I just chip in on what Robert was saying before? And I absolutely 100% agree that, you know, if there is going to be a real sort of cultural embracing of inclusion and opportunity within a company, it absolutely has to sit at board level. It has to be a board responsibility. And I've got a really good example of this. We have just finished putting together the sustainability strategy for Airtel Africa, so running across 14 African markets. And a lot of work before the strategy was put in place, before we ever got involved, a lot of work was ongoing around making sure each Airtel Africa office in all those 14 markets was fully accessible to people who perhaps had mobility problems, and they were already working on, 33% female representation at board level. But those responsibilities sat very much within a sort of an HR function and didn't touch the rest of the business. In putting together the sustainability strategy, we were able to, as well as launching new targets, we were able to bring that work they were already doing and make it part of that strategy. And there was a very kind of turnkey moment in the development of the strategy when the board suddenly realized that developing a sustainability strategy and all the work around diversity and inclusion that is part of that isn't necessarily something that just sits in a function. It fundamentally changes the way you do business. It changes the way the company thinks about itself. It changes the decisions the company makes. It changes the way it makes decisions. And it was kind of like this big aha moment for the board of Airtel Africa. And I think since then, they have seen the whole business wake up to the idea of increasing diversity and building opportunities and making the business more inclusive. And it's now got a kind of a life of its own. So now everyone sees that this is part of the DNA of the business. There are new initiatives starting all over the business, across every operation, that are building on that. So I think it does sit at board level, but I think it really needs to kind of become part of the DNA of the company as well.
Samson, just thinking about, your work is around, economic empowerment for women and girls in agriculture. How does kind of culture play out in your organization, and what are some of the cultural challenges that you experience that if you like hold back women and girls from going forward and owning assets in agriculture, and how have you overcome those?
Thanks for that question, Chris. One of the key challenges that faces agriculture in terms of driving inclusion is the sector is quite male-dominated, and it starts all the way from the baseline, looking at land ownership, especially in developing countries. Majority of the land is male-owned, and as you know, land is a critical factor in agricultural production. So if you don't own land, it poses a sort of a baseline challenge in terms of being able to participate in food production. So the other challenge that we face, or sort of faces agriculture in driving inclusion, is access to the right tools, the right kind of information, and the right kind of equipment and technologies to be able to participate, especially for women. And one of the key things we are doing that is basically targeting the structures where women are participating. And if we look at one of the case studies I've highlighted about Corteva women in agriculture, we have approached it by looking at, we have approached it through women group, where women are already participating in an economic empowerment activity. And so what we have done, whatever they're already doing, we are sort of enhancing it. The money they bring together, we are able to help them sort of grow it by participating in agriculture, and being able to grow it by planting maize and selling it. And out of that, they're able to sort of make a meaningful livelihood out of it.
I see. So by showing people, seeing other women doing that, they get the idea, that gives them the confidence to have a go.
Yeah. And maybe one of the key challenges that's not talked about facing smallholder farmers across is access to finance. So when you're able to aggregate these groups such that you're able to sort of bring their resources together, that helps address some of these challenges that may not be so much within our scope. As you know, financing, especially for helping access to capital, is quite a big challenge for smallholder farmers. So when you are able to sort of approach it from a group that already has that in mind, by who are already pulling their resources together, we are able to sort of add on top of that by empowering them to be growers and make a livelihood.
Yes, thank you. It strikes me it's so important that how businesses and organizations behave and how they present themselves, to make it clear to these groups that, yeah, you can do this. You would be welcome if you joined us, either as a customer or as an employee. I just wondered sort of if there's anything that you could share, sort of good practice, if you like, how you can sort of present yourself to the world to be more inviting, I suppose, to different groups of people.
Sorry, hold on. Hello, Chris.
Hi, welcome back. Hi.
Thank you. I'm sorry I missed part of the conversation. I was busy connecting.
No
I'm sorry, really sorry.
Yeah. I was just saying, is there any examples of how organizations can I suppose just make a better pitch to diverse, to improve diversity and inclusion, to encourage people who perhaps wouldn't have thought about applying or approaching an organization before, to make it clear that they would be welcome. Any sort of suggestions there for people?
I think and the other panelists will have real life examples of this, but I think this ties in a lot with, we see a lot of our clients in Africa, but not just in Africa, across the world, looking to build a more diverse and inclusive workforce, but struggle when the applicants all seem to come from the same sort of pool of people. So they keep recruiting in the like of their existing kind of their existing employment base. But these companies are very, very keen, and I think that's when a lot of companies start doing work at a much younger level, so training up the next generation. So I think it's setting expectations that not just for today's recruitment needs, but for tomorrow's. So that's why we see a lot of companies now investing in STEM education for girls at quite a young level, because it is about building the belief that they will have a career and that there are different opportunities, but also building a future workforce for that company to have a sustainable future.
Yeah. So I actually wish most of the African continent would experience what Rebecca is talking about, because I do believe it's the right approach. You have to invest in education. And that's why I said, if you invest in education for people with disabilities, you invest in the future of disability, because it will trickle down to your employment and into your whatever innovations you develop, whatever employment structures you have. Because the challenge we have is that there's been limited investment in people with disabilities in the continent. So when there's no qualified people to take on some of these positions, I said, partly it's true. One of the issues sometimes is employers post jobs on places where people with disabilities do not have access. So that's an issue. But also it's true that the pool sometimes, depending with the job description, can be very limited. But that's where I was saying, as much as everybody is going for the low-hanging fruit right now and saying we're embracing disability, that is fantastic, because if we capture the low-hanging fruit, it shows us that actually we can make progress in this space. But how about the future? Where's our pipeline coming from? So we want investments in education. And that's why I said, if you have an employment program for people with disabilities, it needs to be complemented by an education program, because then you're showing us where your pipeline is coming from. You're actually showing us you truly care about investing in disability. So that's my take. And my hope is that Africa can embrace exactly what Rebecca is talking about. The reality, Rebecca, is most of these companies are actually multinationals, and they actually have these structures in place in their head offices or in their first world countries. But the point is, their global strategies never trickle down, especially to continents like Africa or third world countries. And that's where the problem is. So you'll find you go to one company here, they talk disability, they talk accessibility. You come on the ground, nobody knows what you're even talking about. So I think there needs to be, if you have a global strategy, we need to make sure it trickles down, because A company brand is a company brand. It doesn't mean when I see a company in the US and it's in Kenya, for me, it's one company. But at the same time, we need to make sure that as companies, when we are working locally in African countries, we are following some of the laws. Like I said, 5%, it's a requirement by Kenyan government. How many multinationals are actually following the 5% rule? So those are some of the things that are missing. So there's a lot of work to be done.
And I think just to support what Irene said, and also actually what Robert said, if companies aren't when they're building their inclusion in their current workforce, if they're not investing in the future, it really does undermine any claim that they want to make around authenticity, which is what Robert was saying was absolutely critical.
Yeah, and one of the things that Irene was mentioning about companies that operate across multiple markets. I wonder, how you've got any sort of thoughts about how companies can apply a consistent D&I policy globally, particularly where you've got different legislative environments in different countries, and also different cultural environments where some of the issues may be controversial, may be difficult, and you're trying to sort of increase representation in areas which can be can be very, very sensitive in terms of religion or sexuality or whatever. So any sort of thoughts and observations about how organizations can apply consistent D&I strategies globally? Robert, is that something you've seen help companies with?
Sure. I mean, I wanted to comment on that briefly, and I think given that these organizations, if it's a multinational, for example, they'll find themselves at different stages of development, depending on which market we're talking about. That if they can document the process so that they understand what they need to do globally in terms of having a standard structure for having D&I, and then document those standards, and then actually set pace markers for themselves, right? Such that, they could say, in a year from now, we want to have moved from A to B. In 2 years, we want to move from B to C, and on and on and on. But be very deliberate in terms of documenting it. I think due to the differences in culture, legislation, different geographies, that is probably one way in which these cross-border firms can be able to have some sort of standardized practice around the world, depending on where they're working. Because like I mentioned earlier, I don't think it happens overnight, but it has to be a very deliberate effort that is documented, and they put a plan in place so that if you're headquartered in the UK and you have operations in Kenya, you need to get the Kenyan operation up to some standard that you've agreed upon globally, but that has to be documented, and you're actually measuring and tracking your progress towards that.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe if I can add something, I do agree with Robert that it needs to be a deliberate effort. The one thing I wanted to point out is it's as simple as also allocating funding. If you don't allocate a budget, it will never happen. And I'll say this because I've met a lot of employees from multinationals in Kenya, especially when we are talking about the work we do. The employees actually embrace disability, and they know there's a desperate need. But sometimes what you find, what is going on the ground is dictated by their corporate office. So what happens, if it's not an emergency there, then what happens on the ground, there's no funding allocated for this. And this makes it very difficult for employees who really want to push this agenda on the ground. So funding, budgets are a very, very critical piece of this equation. The other issue we found in disability is most businesses look at the number. If I have X budget, what's the impact? Their impact is based on number of people. What people don't realize, our programs today, we have at least 1,000 students attending per day. But for me, 1,000 students is like 100,000 students, because these are students who are blind and low vision. But this is like 100,000 mainstream students. So for someone who's running a business, they look at 1,000, they're like, it's not worth my investment. So that's another issue, an issue of numbers that we need to deal with. So if we are going to make progress, we have to look at the whole ecosystem and sort of figure out what are the multiple issues that are really slowing down the pace of inclusion. And at the same time, businesses have to engage, really acknowledge assistive technology as a critical product that's used by people with disabilities for them to be able to have access to resources or products and services. And once we do that, once we begin to understand that, once we create awareness in the company, because most people don't even understand. If you ask most people, if I'm in a meeting with a blind person, what am I supposed to do? Most people have no idea. So awareness raising within the company, and this starts with the leadership all the way to the lower level staff, all these factors are necessary for us to be able to make any movement. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene. I wanted to ask the panel whether they've seen any change over the recent years about what are the sort of real drivers for increasing diversity and inclusion in businesses and in organizations. I think, you know, Robert, you talked a lot about the sort of impact on the bottom line, the sort of the financial business benefits of it. But I wonder if if people feel that that's changed over recent years and people now see other benefits to diversity and inclusion around sort of values and creating a sort of workforce for the future, whether there's other drivers that are coming into play at the moment.
Can I kick off with this one? I think there definitely are, and the two that I've seen emerging, I've been working in kind of sustainability in its broadest kind of sense, including diversity and inclusion, for about 10 years now. And over that time, first of all, it was a small, even 10 years ago, it was a handful of companies in the kind of the global scheme of it. It was a small percentage of companies that really were companies that had purpose and were had much more humanity about them and really did want to address this and idea of inclusion and opportunity. I think the two things I've seen develop over the last 10 years are, number one, the need to develop employer brands. So it's becoming increasingly difficult for companies to find the right people for their business and to bring in that sort of fresh thinking and everything they need. And so there is more competition amongst employers to make themselves as attractive as possible. And I think a lot of companies have now woken up to the fact that to build their workforce for today, but also for tomorrow, they need to make it more attractive, which means they need to have a much more diverse sort of approach to their recruitment. So I think there is there's that side of it, the very human side of it. But the other thing that we've seen emerge is the rise of the ESG ratings, ethical investment, responsible investment, and the need for companies to publish, or listed companies to publish, sustainability strategies. And consumers are choosing on that basis, but also critically investment in the banking communities is rating companies on that basis. So I think companies are now have that side as well, the investment, the institutional requirement to do this. And if they're going to have to be transparent and report their numbers around diversity, inclusion, carbon footprint, environmental controls, everything they're doing, then this is a key element. And I think that's also driving companies to look at this much more seriously now. Yes,
Robert, do you notice any changes over recent years reflecting that?
Chris, I wanted to just share a brief story about Emmanuel Faber, the former CEO of Danone, who leading a global conglomerate actually started transitioning some of these units into a B Corp, and a very progressive individual, right? But Emmanuel Faber was actually willing to risk his position as the CEO when he was ousted by the shareholders earlier this year, right? Just because of being very progressive in terms of the sustainability approach of the business, diversity and inclusion, and actually transitioning some of the Danone units into B Corps. And so he left, right? But the beauty about it is that he was very clear in his mind about why he was doing what he was doing, and the fact that two minority shareholders who together owned less than 6% of the business decided to oust him, right? It's ridiculous, right? So Danone was doing very well in terms of profitability, in terms of turnover, but these shareholders were concerned that he was probably more focused on other activities rather than core business. And I think that's a challenge that many CEOs face and many leaders face. And I think when we speak about walking the talk, they have to be willing to, if need be, leave their role for them to remain as progressive individuals. And we've seen other cases, leaders such as Paul Polman, who still continue to talk about running progressive businesses, large established businesses that have been around for hundreds of years. And it is not easy trying to transition those businesses from the old way of thinking into a new way of thinking and focusing on diversity and inclusion, sustainability, and putting profit last, people first, right? People, purpose, and then profit right at the end of that chain. It's not an easy transition for many of them, I think.
Yeah. I mean, mentioning Unilever and Danone makes me think about those are two very progressive companies who have made a big impact, I think. But that makes me think about the supply chain. That's another sort of driver that I've seen recently. It's one thing, looking to your own business, but we're all part of supply chains, and increasingly, people are looking at the whole supply chain and making sure that diversity, inclusion, and sustainability is represented. There's no weak link in the chain, and particularly Samson, in your area, these women and girl farmers are often selling to big multinationals and processors. I wondered if you've seen any sort of trend there as people look at the entire supply chain and making sure that diversity inclusion runs, not just beyond your own business, but throughout the supply chain.
Can I
Samson,
add something?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, a bit of freeze. I think that's a very good question, Chris. And I would like to point out something I've seen come up, especially with companies which are multinationals and operating in markets like Africa and other developing regions. When you don't make inclusion or diversity part of your agenda, I think there's that risk of being seen as just extracting value. And with that comes the loss of social license to operate. And I would like to give an example of a bit of our experience in Africa. And, some markets are quite volatile in terms of the levels of inequalities. And looking at, for instance, a case of South Africa, any company operating there, and I know there's the legal requirement for you to comply with, there's a BBBEE program, but even beyond that, there's that risk of the company losing the social license to operate or being viewed by the society as just extracting value and not giving anything back. And maybe just to go back, tied to the question we had asked earlier about what companies need to do to be able to sort of mainstream inclusion at all levels. I think there's that need to understand the local context. You can have your global strategy, but if you don't localize it, and localizing it means understanding the local context, what are the key drivers of inequalities, what are the key things that are making, that are of concern to the special groups that you're targeting. And that's what I've seen as one of the challenges, as opposed to coming with one fits all kind of strategy and approach in addressing or in integrating diversity and inclusion in the local markets. So that's one approach I've seen. The society becoming quite conscious on what the business is doing, the value they are adding, their diversity and inclusion agenda and strategy around that. Yeah, and definitely a lot of companies coming with big proclamations. We want to achieve this number by this date, and be not thinking about what needs to happen in the background to be able to achieve that. What needs to be happening? What are the targets? What are the milestones that will build towards this? So a lot of that needed, and especially when looking at companies that have global operations and operating in different markets across the world.
Irene, you wanted to say something?
Yeah. I'll mention, it might sound off, but I have two things. One is I wanted to give an example. I think Robert was talking about we need not to prioritize profits, because profits will come if actually invest in diversity and inclusion, and that's a reality. And he reminded me of one of my contacts. We were on a panel together, and she said she's a judge actually in Kenya, and she is blind, and she's a magistrate, and she said, I qualify as a magistrate in Kenya, but I'm totally blind, but I don't qualify to get an ATM card to be able to have access to my own money or to transact independently. And that was very powerful for the financial sector, because bottom line is she wants to use her money, but you've made it clear she cannot have her Visa card because she's blind. Actually, that's the only reason. Her disability does not allow her. So that's something for businesses to think about. What are some of the policies we have in place that actually affects our profits, bottom line, because that's what happens. So there's that one point. The second point is I have a question from Maxwell. He says, to your point on 5% requirement, how does an organization handle integrating people with disabilities into their workforce in a manner that gives them dignity and does not come across as tokenism? And I think that's a fantastic question, because one, there's a huge assumption every time. And that's why I started when I was talking about digital accessibility. I say people with disabilities are not asking for favors. They're just asking you to give them access to the same information. Let me transact the way I'm supposed to transact independently. So to Maxwell's question, employers need to understand that most of the time, people with disabilities are not looking for favors. If anything, they prefer when you treat them like a human being who deserves to be where they are because they qualify to be there. So it's important, if you have employment opportunities, to make sure that the people you're going for meet some of the job requirements that they're supposed to meet. And if they don't, if you see someone has great potential, invest in their training. And when they are working in your company, give them the correct accommodation so that they don't depend on other people. Because what happens is if they can't function properly in their job environment, they realize that you're only doing this to meet your 5% goal. So if you make sure they meet the job requirements, and if they don't, if someone has potential, invest in their training, and then focus on their performance, not on their disability. Their disability will only come in if they need a certain accommodation, if something like that. But if we can focus on ensuring that they qualify for the jobs and we help them to qualify, that will be fantastic. So that there's no assumption that even people with disabilities can assume that I deserve this job because I have a disability. I do have employees who have disabilities, by the way, and I always tell them, I'm not keeping you because you have a disability, I'm keeping you because of your performance. And there's no two way about it. So that's what I can say. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene. Thank you, Irene. I think we just got a minute or so for one final point of discussion. I'd just like to ask the panel, if you're working for an organization that just doesn't get it, just doesn't get the importance of diversity and inclusion, what one thing would you say to that organization to make the scales fall away from their eyes and to change? Who wants to take that one? Bex, you're on mute.
Sorry. I think that's where everything Robert told us about measurement and being able to demonstrate the value. So we know that B Corps are, it might be people, planet, profit, or people, purpose, profit. Profit might be the last on the list, but profit is still one of those three P's. So it is about profitability.
Sign up to B Corp.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, thank you. We just coming to the end of the session now, so I'd just like to thank all of the panelists. Absolutely fascinating, wonderful presentations, great discussion. I've certainly learned a great deal. And I'm going to hand back to Eva to wrap things up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you again to all the panelists for joining us for this last session in the Force for Good series that we've been running this year. As Maxwell mentioned at the beginning, Hudson Sandler has been walking the journey with us as we initiated this, this initiative at AmCham. It is a long-standing initiative for us. It is a key strategy for the organization, and we will keep moving with it. This year, what we've done is conduct these roundtables to really understand where our members are in terms of prioritization of sustainability within their core business, understand what the American community is doing here in Kenya, amplify it, but also bring out what the challenges and opportunities are. I think the key thing I've taken away from all 4 sessions is that partnerships, and partnerships. I think a lot of people come in it, like what Samson said, they come in, they say, oh, we need to have a CSR program. We need to fund 5,000 women. They don't check who else is operating in that region, who can amplify their efforts, and how to actually do it in a more effective and efficient way to provide the impact that they're looking for. So we will carry this forward. A lot of what we've learned in the 4 roundtables will be culminated in the first ever AmCham Force for Good report, which we will be doing in partnership with Hudson and Sandler. And hopefully, Rebecca, we will have you here next year for the official launch of that report in person. In addition to the roundtables in gathering information, we also have a survey, and my colleague will post the survey in the chat box. It is completely anonymous. It will take you all of 2 minutes to complete. It will just help us in identifying what are the key activities that we can run under the program and how AmCham can be work with the organizations in AmCham to help them strategize and come up with their sustainability and impact story here in Kenya. So with that, I just want to say thank you again so much, Chris and Rebecca. I look forward to picking this up with you again in January, and thank you to the panelists for your time and the participants for staying with us this afternoon. I think Maxwell, you want to get a picture?
Okay, 1, 2, 3. All right, we'll quickly take a snapshot. Yeah. There we go. I think we got it. Thank you very much for everything. Hudson Sandler, for your partnership, and all the speakers who participated in today's session. I think it's been wonderful. It's been quite edifying for me personally, and I'm sure those who've attended as well have been edified. So I just want to wish everybody happy holidays. Do take care of yourselves, and we look forward to linking up again in the new year. Thank you, and bye-bye.